faculty in the art department and the curricular head of the sculpture area. It's a pleasure to introduce tonight's visiting artist, Diana Al-Hadid. Diana received her BFA in sculpture and a BA in art history from Kent State University in 2003, and her MFA in sculpture from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2005. She also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2007. Diana has had recent solo exhibitions at the Harry Rubenstein Gallery in New York and the Hammer Museum in LA. Her work has been included in group shows across the country and internationally in Milan, Rome, London, Abu Dhabi, Istanbul, Sharjah, and Berlin. She has upcoming solo shows this year at La Conserva in Murcia, Spain, and the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas. Diana's work has been recognized through highly prestigious awards and grants from the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and the United States Artist Rockefeller Fellows Program. We are thrilled to have you here, all the way from Brooklyn. Please join me in welcoming Diana Al-Hadid.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you all for coming. And I just want to say it was really nice walking around and looking at everyone's work today. Can you guys sit? I'm going to shoot this one first. No big boom? Can you hear me? Does that make any difference? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thank you all for coming. And I can't see this anymore. Sorry. Yeah, it's been nice to actually see some of your work, and you'll get a chance to crit me now, maybe afterwards. So I'm actually including a lot of undergrad work, more than usual. I mean, not a lot, but just some things, because I've noticed recently a lot of my work is, you kind of can't escape yourself. A lot of it's kind of coming back in dim ways from stuff that I was probably looking at in undergrad, maybe even sooner. But I put this image up because it's a kind of like my inspirational piece for an early work that I did. I was born in Syria, and when I went back, I think this was when I was about 18 or 19, we visited Tripoli in Lebanon and went to this cave. And it just left this really big impression on me. I was raised in Ohio, and the only kind of interior spaces that were this massive that I'd seen in Ohio were like shopping malls. And, this was just like a really profound way to experience nature, but also there's all this artificial lighting. And around that time, I proposed to, and there's like a second layer of a river, kind of underneath of water you can kind of boat through. It's really amazing. It's somewhere between heaven and hell, I think, that place. But so around this time, I proposed to do, it's basically like my first installation, and I was really resistant to working with traditional sculpture materials, I guess. I really didn't, I think I wanted quick and effective material or processes, and I don't know, I was really not into working with wood and whatever. I learned how to weld a little bit, but I started stapling these paper plates, and I wanted to make an interior space that was a little bit maybe inspired by that cave that I was at. And so you'd walk through this hallway and kind of come around the corner, and you'd be in this room filled with these, stapled paper plates, and the walkway was just kind of held up a little bit with some armature, but most of it was just stapled. At the time, I think I was distracted into believing I was really interested in, everyday materials or accumulation or something. I think later what I learned, as I would kind of continue my work, was that I was really more into, making kind of architectural spaces, or working with thin planes and lines. And anyway, I learned about the kind of structural integrity of these stapled paper plates when I just previously had made this piece. This was at my undergrad at this really intensive kind of summer class called Blossom, and you have like 2 weeks to make this. So I kind of had a week to. You have 2 weeks to make like 2 works, and so I made this kind of oversized paper plate princess dress, kind of like a parade float thing, and you come from the back and like you kind of poke up her skirt, and there's a little dress that my grandma made. My family, it was kind of a history of dressmakers, and I took the idea from my mom. Actually, it was a Halloween costume, so that was me and as a paper plate princess winning the award. I was also like paper plate flower, and so I kind of stole this idea from my mom. Every year I was like paper plate something. So I had to give her some credit. And then I was also making these kind of like pod places. They're kind of these meditative places that were a little bit influenced by, just stuff you'd buy at Home Depot. Again, these really amorphous kind of, insular spaces. And still not really object-based. I was really into this idea of place, and I never really wanted to make something that was something you'd walk around and, something that you'd experience more environmentally, I guess. So I'm going to go through some of the undergrad stuff a little fast. But this was something I made too. When you're in school and you don't have, especially as an undergrad, you don't have a studio space to work in. You have to kind of come up with ways around not having a studio. And so I was carrying around this carpet that, from dorm to apartment, and I started cutting them up, and I made them into these little, and I kind of starched them so that the fabric was rigid. And, even though these are, this is kind of looks a little atypical from my work, again, I think it was me thinking about how to turn something flat into an environment or modeling it somehow. So I laid out all these little small magic carpets on this lecture hall, and they were watching this video, the kind of screensaver with the stars that come at you. So they're kind of flying through space, and there's a little magic carpet in the front, and I called it the Magic Carpet Militia Training Facility. It was one of the kind of, maybe one of the like Arab referenced works that I made. And this slide is like, I don't know if I even titled this, but a really quick piece I made, but I was looking through my old slides and I found it, and I thought it just reminded me so much of some of the work that I'd make later. And using really simple means, I drew like a line of glue on the wall and kind of pressed sand into the line and into the glue, and just kind of made this this weird timepiece harbor situation. It's just weird environments, I guess. And I'm skipping ahead through a lot of embarrassing grad school work that we can talk about later. But this was my thesis show for grad school. And here you can see, I think, probably a little bit of a relationship between the paper plates and this work. But now I'm just kind of, this is all like this fiberglass material that I would kind of form over these structures, and I painted the underside pearlescent. So what I wanted to make, it's called Magic Mountain. What I wanted to make was just kind of imagine this world that was cut from one plane, and kind of the self-generating thing. So you can kind of see this pulling back into the mountain. And at the time, I was really into I guess I still am, but topology, which is, it's a mathematical area of study. It's the study of surfaces, and what's really interesting about it, like for example, what would be, I don't understand. I'm going to throw out a lot of these like math and physics things that I don't really understand, but in a kind of a broad concept or a sculptural concept, I think I relate, or I want to understand it. But what topology is like, for example, what something would be topologically equivalent would be like a donut and a mug, because there's like one perforation, and you can kind of stretch the surface to fit. So I thought that was just like a beautiful idea because I realized that a lot of the things that I was making had to do with skins and surfaces and kind of laminating the two so that the surface was now a skin. And so moving forward, I am now in New York, and I think that this year, my first year in New York, looking back now, it was kind of maybe my homesick year or something, because I kind of started to really think about, this sense of dislocation and, I don't know, but outlining places that I'd been or places that I was going, and the idea of bridging the gap between the two, and especially bridging the gap between not places only, but also scales. So, for example, I imagined that there was this woman, and this relates a little bit back to the dress, wearing this hoop skirt in the shape of Ohio, and she gets really dizzy, and that's also another theme, this kind of fainting, dizzying woman that dances. And so she can see that this is a upside down Ohio, and that's kind of her skirt. And then she gets kind of extruded, and she gets pulled through. And this is like figurative in the loosest sense of the term. She kind of gets pulled through these mountains, and they get incised. This like kind of heart-shaped thing incises goes through the mountains, and in her velocity, her puffy sleeves fly off, and there's like a little sand harbor. And on the other side, right here, I don't have a picture of it, but it's a little cookie cutter in the shape of Syria. So it's kind of like a dog chasing his tail, and then her feet are in North Canton, Ohio, which is where my family is. So trying to make like kind of an illustration of my kind of narrative, my little narrative history, or where I'm coming from, and I realized too that this was a time when I was really interested in, a lot of my work is really large, it still is really large, but I also really like focusing on these details and fussing a lot. So I realized that I have like a strong devotion to either ends of the scale. So this really small and the really large, and it's become something of real curiosity to me. Like I really spent like a week modeling these little feet. You can't tell now, but anyway, I think the reason I wasn't maybe making the things in the middle is because maybe the viewer, maybe me, took that space. Like the figure was kind of that middle space between the two extremes. That's my speculation about why I psychologically kind of excluded that. And I'm still in New York, but I had a chance to make an installation, and this is one called Immodest Mountain. And I called it that because running along the edge of that parting valley is a zipper that folds and unfolds. And I kind of imagine that like God would have made the world in like one kind of fell zip, one swoop of the zipper. And I kind of couldn't resist the sexual innuendo, so I put this cast Victoria's Secret underwear in the part. And it was when I used to have more of a sense of humor. I think that was my last remotely humorous piece. This piece is one of the smaller things that I made, and when you're in New York and you have a studio, it's really hard to like continue to make full-scale installation pieces. So I got to work on a smaller thing, and this one a little bit relates to my history. I was reading a lot of Borges, and I learned that so much of the inspiration for his work came from the 1001 Arabian Nights. So I started reading a little bit about that, and I learned that the storyteller. This is called finally the Emancipation of Shahrazad, and I kind of wanted to make a monument for Shahrazad, who's the woman who told the stories of the 1001 Arabian Nights, and I liked her story because, well, the collection of stories like Aladdin and everything you watched on Disney probably is that it's a very like self-referential. It's like a story within a story, and it's kind of like the first evidence of like early evidence of like science fiction and an unreliable narrator, and there's a lot of like juicy concepts. And of course, like I grew up watching Disney movies and knowing the stories too from when we were living in Saudi Arabia, and I didn't know like who was telling them really. And then her story is that she was the daughter of the executioner, who was there's a king who discovered that his queen was having an affair. He got really angry and swore vengeance against all women, and decided he would kill a virgin every night. So he asked the executioner to find a virgin, and you know he would marry her, and then the next night he'd kill her. And the executioner was like obviously really distraught by this, and so his daughter, wanting to alleviate him of this misery, kind of volunteered herself and said, "I'm, you know, give me to the king. I will take care of this." And so her way of solving this problem was to tell these stories with cliffhangers, so that the king couldn't kind of kill her because he'd want to hear the story. So it's kind of like her art form was her sort of salvation, or it was like it was kind of like saved all of women. So I had her standing on this pedestal, sort of, or this ground outlining Syria, again, outlining these maps. And I actually, and then it begins with the Aladdin's lamp, and there's a little evil eye. I learned at the time that the transcription had come from the oral tradition was first transcribed by a Frenchman who was visiting Aleppo, Syria, which is where I was born. And so I started reading a little bit more about Aleppo, and of course I'd been there a number of times visiting, but had this kind of like really long distance relationship with it. And it used to be, so what I did was I carved this little medieval castle, which is the citadel that this Aleppo was first all encompassed in the citadel. And it's like one of the oldest cities in the world, like maybe the third oldest or something. It's incalculably old. And it's like a weird thing to like be in like the suburbs of Ohio and like know that you're just from there. I don't know. I remember having to tell people when I was like in elementary school that I'm not from here, I'm from Syria. And my friend's dad was like, "That's halfway around the world, you know?" I got really panicked. I was like 7. So I remember that like distance. It was weird. So what I did was kind of extended the branch, and I imagine that, and in reading about Aleppo, I learned about all of these kind of the layers of civilization that had, that surrounded the landscape, and there are all these Hellenistic ruins, and I learned about the Corinthian Order, and I kind of imagined that the city was standing on top of this floating Corinthian column, and the top of it, the kind of like a cork on a champagne bottle, kind of snapped off and flew to the other side of the room, and so that would be the top of the Corinthian column, and those are my casts of my sandals, and the sculpture is kind of levitating a little bit. I started to get really careful about how the sculpture is related to the floors, and started to feel really sacred about the floors. I realized I'd never really set anything very properly on the floor. And then the bridge breaks at Michelangelo's, this Sistine Chapel. So I was reading a little bit about the Corinthian Order, and I learned that it was invented by a sculptor, actually, who was walking along the grave of a young woman, and he found that there was this like overgrowing votive of acanthus leaves, and it was like a beautiful and sad image, and so he made the Corinthian Order, and it's supposedly of the 5 like the very most feminine and the most ornate, and so I kind of went to work kind of either pulling out the kind of curves or the femininity or destroying them, I don't know. But I had them all erecting this floppy map. I realized I had kind of made outlines of all these places, and I felt like I couldn't stretch my arms wide enough to fit the parameters of a room or or the map of a place. And I decided like the only way to get this out of my system would be just like a draw a map of the world. And so I outlined Pangaea, which was obviously it's the supercontinent. So when everything was kind of like sucked into one focal point. And that also kind of, I think, harkened back to some of my other stuff where, I'd find like kind of a central core or something. So anyway, I imagine that this was like this post-apocalyptic world, and you just have to trust me that this is actually a map of Pangaea. It kind of looks like a failed party or something. But, well, anyway, on that topic, there's this dinosaur that, again, kind of dizzy and kind of passes out in the middle of this scene, and she's kind of like trailed through this this lava red carpet, and there are these footprints where she was dancing the waltz and getting dizzy and then kind of passing. I started to get really into the waltz, and these are the eggs that kind of birth. This is where the narrative gets really complicated. You don't have to really know the narrative probably to care or to whatever, but I'm just telling you because I'm here. So this is her in the middle. She's kind of oozing this pearlescent goo. Anyway, so in all of my studying of these classical architecture, I started to look more at Gothic architecture, and having read a little bit about the waltz, I decided the next thing I wanted to do was make this the cathedrals. These Gothic cathedrals are like the most epic of buildings, and they were really kind of like the first spaceships. They were really like the way that people intended to reach God, and it was super interesting architecturally because it's like the first time that the structure starts being made visible. And so the buttresses are now on the outsides of the buildings, and they're just really beautiful structures. And I was raised Muslim, so it is really a novel thing to me. I mean, it's novel to anybody probably traveling around Europe. But so where the waltz comes in was I taught myself how to dance the waltz, and I put paint on the soles of my feet, and I danced the female and then the male, and wherever my feet kind of hit the floor, I plant a stake of one of the spires. And so the female was the nave, and the male was were the flying buttresses. And then, if you remember the one piece that was the yellow kind of extruded Ohio skirt, I think my work was a lot more precious. Maybe in grad school, maybe I was a little more self-conscious than I realized. And so now I start burning them, and I kind of loosen up my attitude, and I flipped it upside down, obviously, because I guess, I don't know, I wanted to ground it or something. But the most, I think, sacrilegious component is the exposed feet. I don't know if you guys remember, recently in the Egyptian kind of the uprising, I don't know if you remember the picture of, people holding up shoes. Anyway, in Arabic tradition, it's like a real sign of disrespect to show the soles of your feet or to show shoes. And so for me, looking at these, the soles turned up to heaven, it's like a really bad sign. But no one ever notices that. But maybe my personal joke. And that's the inside kind of burned out. And you can see I'm kind of letting some of the screws, just revealing the process in the same way that maybe a Gothic architect might have, not quite as rough, but anyway. So I'm starting now to I was looking at so many pictures of Gothic cathedrals, and I noticed in a few of them, again, some layering of different civilizations. And there's this Celtic symbol on the floors of Chartres and Amiens, and it's this labyrinth. And of course, that attracted me, I think, on a metaphorical level because of the circular nature and this kind of spinning and dizzying effect, and also kind of tracing your path from beginning to end. And but I think even more so, sculpturally speaking, I was really attracted to the labyrinth, because of its kind of the economy of space, it's really just wall and non-wall, and it's so beautifully designed, and maybe that's the undercover modernist coming out in me or something. But I try to be also very efficient and careful about, how I use space internally too, and you can usually see through my work, I think. So it's still not like a real discrete object, although they are still, big objects. But so what I did was took the labyrinth and kind of, again, made a map on the floor and extruded it and kind of pulled the console up and pinched the bottom. And the console became the console of this spaceship and also the console of this pipe organ. And the insides, when I started looking at the insides of these cathedrals, I started noticing the beautiful pipe organs, which are like the most epic, instruments of all times, the mother of all instruments, they're so-called. And when I was reading a little bit about fugues and organ music, they're also very layered and very labyrinthian. And I came across this guy who isn't very well known, but inspired Bach's well-tempered clavier, and his name was Fischer, and he wrote this piece of music called Ariadne music, and he took the title from the myth of Theseus and Ariadne. Theseus was the guy who killed the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and Ariadne gave him this ball of thread, and the thread was meant to, he'd walk through the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur, and to find his way out, he would re-wrap the thread into a ball and kind of trace his way back out of the maze. And so it's this kind of beautiful metaphor of like the distance between two lovers, and also like the way to kind of navigate yourself through difficult territory. And so this composer thought of his piece of music as a labyrinth of different layers, and the subject of the composition was the thread that would guide you through the music. And I thought that was like just a really beautiful metaphor musically. So I stole that a little bit too. So I called it a measure of Ariadne's love, and a measure meaning like a musical measure and a physical measure. So you can see the thread starts here, and it would trace, and this is so going around it. And these are all like aluminum. Well, these are like cast keys, and it's depressed at his first note. And all the aluminum pipes are aluminum here, and then cardboard at the top. They're kind of spitting out their music and their notes. And this is the kind of where it begins, where it's pinched, and you can follow that thread through and kind of fall into the center. So now I get really into pipe organs, and also like still kind of this cosmic music, and I had learned, I was listening to the radio, it's like NPR, you can Google this, I swear it's true, that black holes emit the sound of B flat, like 57 octaves below middle C. And that just kind of freaked me out, and I thought it was also like really beautiful. I was driving, I had to pull over, it was really crazy. Anyway, so I wanted to make like basically a portal. This is called Portal to a Black Hole. So I wanted to make this temple that was kind of like an architectural interpretation of a black hole, and it would play B flat. And B flat apparently is like this weird musical note where like crocodiles respond to it funny, and I don't know. It's just look it up. It's really weird. Anyway, so I made this kind of this gaping, this kind of an architectural black hole, this like gaping dome with this oculus kind of blown out, and a spiraling staircase in the middle with like the keys. And so now I'm still trying to kind of make to really combine architecture and music. And I learned about another kind of cosmic sound. I learned that the Nobel Prize was given to these scientists, Penzias and Wilson, for discovering the basically like the cosmic background radiation, which pointed to it was the sound of the Big Bang. And it's actually that interruption, the radiation comes through your TVs when there's like the black and white speckles. Again, it's like to try to make material some of these completely hard to conceive, like completely hard to imagine and calculate. It was really exciting for me, and it's also, I think, kind of like maybe one of the most fundamental enterprises of an artist is to try to make material these things that are absolutely impossible, in kind of a funny way, I think. So I started looking into the Big Bang, and there's so many funny ways that the world will end. Like there's potentially like the Big Crunch and the Big Freeze, and it's like weird science fiction sounding ways that we're going to all perish. I mean, not anytime soon, but just potentially like global warming first. But so I thought, the kind of the structure of our doom was really parallel to like a Greek tragedy, in which you kind of like the one of the defining characteristics is that the protagonist willingly steps into his doom, knowing that he made some mistake that is irreversible. And so again, trying to make like an architectural version of this, I had this staircase that you'd kind of climb, or the protagonist would climb, and you'd fall into this kind of abyss. It's called the Record of Immortal Universe. So there was this kind of like pooling black record, and as you'd climb up, this is kind of hard to describe, but I tried to make it seem like it would make sense. But these strings would kind of connect to the tempo above, and it would shake, and it would vibrate the puddle, and it would play these pipes. I'm sorry, these are really terrible pictures, but these pedals. And that's the back. And then I kind of wanted to make like a kind of a smaller piece. This is called All the Stops, because I learned that phrase comes from pipe organs. It indicates that moment when you depress all the stops in a pipe organ, and all the air goes through, so it's actually really loud. So it's kind of like your most when you're kind of like your end, your wit's end or whatever. And so what I wanted, I took a slice of the Roman Colosseum and imagined that the pipes were in the audience, and it was this really loud arena, and you would be sitting kind of here playing. Actually, you'd be in the arena. And I kind of, I made it all white and kind of mute. And having made that piece, when I saw this painting, I'd seen it before, but something caught my attention. I realized it was because this is Peter Bruegel, and he was also inspired by the Colosseum, obviously. And this is his Tower of Babel, and he made a number of these, and he was like really obsessed with the Tower of Babel, and his paintings were also kind of like infinite and Babel-esque. And what I think what resonated for me about this story, of course, like not being raised with those stories. I mean, they are in Islam, but I guess I wasn't very, that wasn't the stuff we were learning. But the story is just really, it's really incredible, of course, like you probably all know, but just in case there's other Muslims in the room, or just really, I don't know, people like me. It was kind of like the monocultures before cultures were dispersed around the world, presumably before art began, before language, or it was like one language, and they were all kind of in it together to make this building to reach God. And it's already a really ridiculous enterprise, really futile, but God's response is to be like really offended and kind of strike them down and confuse their tongues so they can no longer communicate, and so their lack of ability to communicate like corrupts their big mission, and then they spread out, and then the world moves on, and art is made, and so on. And I kind of just love the maybe the absurdity of God's offense, like why he would be like offended that someone would try to reach him, because I was, everyone's like, oh, God is everywhere. So I don't know, and it's also like the first kind of like spaceship. It's kind of like the first telescope, It's like a, and when you look at these paintings, the scale is just, it's monstrous. It's like, you can see little people right there, maybe. Like, that's a cart. And you're always, like, in this perspective where you're kind of God. Like, there's no way that anyone could see at that level. And I think just Babel just takes, like, people just keep depicting these beautiful structures. And this is this guy, Skykercher. I don't know if you guys have been to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, but he has a room devoted to him. He's this really interesting, eccentric guy. And he kind of mapped out this diagram of, like, how Babel wouldn't work, because as if we needed, like, a scientific explanation. Like, he said that if it got so tall, it would, like, offset the balance of the Earth. And so I wanted to make my my Tower of Babel, I guess, and I imagine that I was really into bees, or the way that bees think, and I can go on about that for a little bit, but I'm going to not right now. So I just imagine that bees help me make this, because they're kind of like work in that same kind of collective consciousness, and the kind of like this tacit understanding that we're all making this thing for a greater good. And so my Babel was kind of made with these honeycombs, and when you round the corner, you see that the footprint is returned to the labyrinth form and extruded again. And imagine that, as you climb the tower, you're also kind of walking to the center of the labyrinth, and the floorboards are kind of ripped up from the ground. And I didn't intend on it being two parts, but it was just one of those things that when I just wanted to be two parts, had to let it go. I think it worked out. And this is the map that I was using around the same time I was making the show. This was like my first kind of comprehensive show in New York that was more than one sculpture in a room, or more than one project. And around the same time that I was making this, it was just around when the Large Hadron Collider was about to kind of detonate, and it got me thinking that it's kind of its own, like, modern day Babel. Like, there's everyone speaking the common language of math, and people from around the world are coming to work on this thing, and it strangely had this really similar look, right? So, and that's not aesthetic. Like, they didn't make any of those decisions aesthetically, but they're just like, damn, how does it look so cool? I don't know. And it's really, again, like, what they're looking for are things that sound like God. They're looking for the God particle, which is the Higgs boson, which is the thing that that gives a particle its mass. And you can see the scale. It's really crazy. And they're trying to make, like, mini Big Bangs. And so anyway, so I called the show Reverse Collider. And this is the docking station. The last piece was called the Tower of Infinite Problems, and this is called the Problem of Infinite Towers. And it's really kind of like the reverse of that other piece. And I imagine that that the kind of temple that held this up it's kind of like these columns that are kind of organically melting on presumably a hot, hellish floor, and their kind of organic pace of melt causes the pistons to move up and down. So again, still making this kind of like mechanical architecture, and it would kind of slot into the top there and come down. And I always made a bunch of drawings, but this was the first time I included them in a show with my sculptures. And this piece is called Self Melt, and it's kind of like a summary of the show a little bit, or kind of like the key, I guess. On the top of it, you can see a little bit more of a semblance to Peter Bruegel's painting, and it's looking at itself as the bottom piece is made from the top, and it's kind of melting. So details, and then more drawings. I make a lot of drawings, and they're really just drawings. They're not studies for the work. I have separate drawings that kind of help me mark it out. And this piece is called Tomorrow's Superstitions, and it's kind of like a Babel eating itself, or in the process of its own making, or kind of corruption. Not sure which. and this piece is kind of a little bit of the cousin piece of the other honeycomb structure. And this time I incorporated more materials, so I was using wood, and the metal starts to get a lot hairier, and it cracks in the middle, and it's kind of falling onto itself. And I started filling the honeycombs with this colored resin. And that was called Built from Our Tallest Tales. And more drawings. I have a lot of drawings. And then this piece was my first outdoor work that I made with very, very few materials. It's kind of like a crazy experience. It's actually really tall. It's probably like, 20-something feet. Like you probably come right here. I don't really remember how tall it is, but it took at least like 2 ladders. But it was in Sharjah, which is outside of Dubai, and it was kind of an interesting context because, they're just building these insane, like the tallest building in the world is there right now, and they're building these crazy structures, and really I just kind of let the structure be itself, I guess, and it's a little bit like Totland's Tower, maybe. Anyway, okay, so I'm now like good on the architectural front. I'm really tired of buildings, I think, or I don't know what, but I realized that there was this gaping blind spot in my work that was figuration, and so much of sculptural history is. I think I'm at my core more of an architect, or not an architect, but someone that thinks or builds architecturally. Or thinks about structure, and but I really would respond to these things. This ability for a sculptor to make something solid look liquid, and the magical kind of transformation that it had. So, and then of course, like the fainting woman, I'm like really into the fainting woman. So, and these religious kind of like these over the top soap opera kind of religious imagery, and what I wanted to do. I realized the most attractive thing to me about these were not so much like her flesh and bones, but her was the drapery and the fluidity of that hard material. And so I wanted to really pull that form out and try to articulate the figure by drawing out the folds of the fabric. So I took all these, and again, maybe this is where my drawings kind of converge with the sculpture. I took all these little metal rods and kind of tried to extrude her form. And from the front, I think it looks, a lot more dimensional. And as I was working, it was really hard to do because I just had that one image. I was like literally welding with this one piece of paper, and it was, it's really hard to kind of like get the whole scope and the full dimension. So by the time I got to the back, it was kind of like this flat piece of paper. And, I wanted to kind of like take her off her base and have her levitate a little bit. Around the same time, you can see a detail of kind of me trying to piece her together. Around the same time, I had a conversation. I kind of re-met a friend of mine from high school who's a world-famous magician, and he specializes in close-up magic, and he would do these card tricks, and you know that there's some trick involved, and but he's so talented. So it's kind of like at some points you kind of wonder, like maybe it is magic. I don't know. Like anyway, so I really I wanted. I thought I could make one more kind of like a more playful tower that was maybe a little more constructive in spirit, and something maybe like a kid would build, but kind of still have this like weightless or really precarious quality. And so this is called Forever Blank Matter. But it got me thinking that I really wanted, I was still really into, the idea of like a levitating woman, or, I wanted to like saw women in half. I don't know. I had all these like magic tricks, that kind of like stage magic that I started thinking I should make that. You can see here, this is a figure, this kind of reclining woman again, and she kind of starts to unravel into this base here, which is it's in the shape of a spiral galaxy, and and she's levitating on these strings, and you can see a little bit of a better picture. And I called it Edge of Critical Density, and it's because I was reading a little bit about. Sometimes I read like physics things, and this was critical density is a cosmological term that it expresses the boundary between an open and a closed universe. So what that means is if when physicists take a measurement of the matter in outer space and weigh it against critical density, they'll be able to tell you basically if our universe is open or closed, meaning if it's expanding or contracting. Right now we're in like, if it's close to critical density, it means it's open. So right now we're expanding. God. It's just a detail. And I loved it as a sculptural term because it's really like, it describes this, like just this boundary, this like positive and negative. And I think as much as, my work looks very dense and filled, I think there's a lot of like openness and transparency and a lot of negative space, which isn't negative, but anyway, it was a really beautiful physics term that sounds very sculptural. Some more drawings. And that takes me to this piece last year, and it's called Water Thief, and it's a I'll explain that in a minute. It's a water clock, which is basically it's any device that measures time by water dripping through the vessel. Like if there's like a hole in a bowl and you can see the time going down, you can tell how much time has passed. This was like back in Babylonian times, and also like candle clocks would be a similar thing. You can see the candle melting and tell how much time has passed. Well, I was reading about that when I was reading about Babylonian times, and I was at the British Museum. They had like the Babylon show, and there's this weird little device that showed how they kind of compensated for daylight savings. It's really sophisticated technologies, and I was on Wikipedia, and I saw this like this Arabic name I didn't recognize. I clicked on it, of course, and his name was Al-Jazari, and he was basically like the Leonardo of the Middle East, and he would just come up with these crazy inventions. He actually cataloged them all in a book called the Book of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, and you can actually recreate his inventions. And one of them that stood out was this kind of Rube Goldberg-esque sounding giant water clock. Technologies when they first start are always like super big. Like the first computer was like the size of a room, and the Large Hadron Collider is super big. Maybe they'll shrink one day. But so I kind of got this crude, and his water clock was like, these mechanical musical instruments and these levers and these pulleys and these falcon automaton, and it was like 12 feet high. It was just this crazy sight. And so I took this kind of map and tried, and this wasn't his, but I wanted to use the room. This is the first time I kind of make an installation, and I have the constant water source kind of coming out from over the ledge of the gallery walls, and it all filters into this machine. And I'm not going to bore you with the mechanics of this. It doesn't work. It's actually intentionally kind of broken, but in the front, the float tank is like broken, and it leaks out and kind of offsets the pointer, which would normally point to this drum dial, which tells you exactly what time it is. And that drum dial is attached to a series of you can see these gears that float, and they're kind of these spiral galaxy gears. Anyway, it's I try to be as faithful as I could to the structure in the same way that I was when I was making my pipe organs, but and they don't actually play. Nothing makes any noise, and nothing flies, and the spaceships don't work. Nothing works. So I should just get that question out of the way now. And these are some of this is his actual, he would draw these miniatures, paintings, and this was kind of a rendering of his. These are the little falcon and the musical, little magician. So mine is very different than his, but I found this image. It was another like little undergrad piece I forgot about, and I realized I was like still trying to make these like floating things, and how funny that. I don't know. I was imagining the kind of color spilling out, and I made a piece very recently that relates to this. And I was making these wax objects and these balloons, and I left one of them in my car, and I came back, and it had melted because it was really hot, but it looked like it deflated. So it's kind of like a happy accident. So I kind of had keep putting the balloons in my car, letting them melt. And I realized that I kind of used that strategy, in a couple pieces later, and especially when I was conceiving of this work, which I literally just finished like 2 weeks ago. And it's my first bronze, and it's called Immortal Repose. And it's this woman. I really still thought I hadn't really really dealt with the woman, like the reclining, the figurative thing. It was still looking very architectural. And so she's kind of, this is like a funny view from the top, but this is, I'm sorry, it's from the Foundry, so they're not the best pictures. But she kind of, the pedestal is made for like a standing erect figure, but she's kind of got a little too relaxed maybe. And she's like playing with her melt there. And then I made a series of feet along with that. This is like my first, in a long time, small work. So I made a bunch of these little, think of them as kind of sketchbooks. And they're, and here it's, again, like I think I'm having like this conflict or this, I'm kind of at war with the pedestal, which is something I never used in my work before, and again, because I think that the ground is kind of very sacred space, and maybe that comes from my religious background or something, I don't know. So there's more drawings. These are a little more recent. And I think, and these also were just last week. So some of my drawings are getting bigger and probably a little hairier. Oh, and I finished this last week, actually, so no one's seen this, but I forgot to put it in here. This is, I probably don't know how to talk about it too well, but again, this is like the bronze kind of leaked into my studio stuff. So I'm kind of making this pedestal that kind of unpacks into this landscape and this kind of painterly image. I think it's the most painterly image of any work I've made before, and there's like this really shallow relief. You can see that it's pretty short, but I think it looks like it has a lot of depth if you're standing in front of it. But the back is kind of bitten out, and it's levitating in the back. And there are these two figures in it. It's called Cenotaph for Two, and a cenotaph is like a monument, usually for like a single person. Like there's a really cool one for Isaac Newton that this architect Boulez came up with, or they're for armies or something. And that's takes us to, that's the end. Thank you. So if there's any questions. None? Okay. No. Yep. Yeah, I didn't actually figure out gravity. There's like metal. There's like a secret hidden metal bars that you can't see. That's how they're. Let you guys know, don't tell. Between us. Yep. Oh, yeah, she just asked that. Yeah. It's okay. So that piece is not actually levitating. Reiterate. There's a metal structure hidden inside, and it's just very well camouflaged. I just figured out this system. So you can't tell from the density of the strings, but if I point them out to you, if we're standing in front of it, I swear they're there. So. Right. I'm sorry. I forget about that a lot. I forget to mention because I kind of use a lot of the materials depending on the piece, but I use a lot of wood and a lot of fiberglass and a lot of foam, and I make a lot of molds, and I kind of like misinterpret a lot of materials. I think if you, and a lot of steel, I weld a lot, so it varies depending on what I need the thing to do, but that's kind of like my Crayola box of materials that I kind of pull from. Like the foam I use when I need something to be light. The steel is structural, metal for construction-y stuff, or wood for construction-y stuff. You just you can tell a little more when you see them, but I kind of just use a lot of fiberglass, and they're kind of materials that I've been little tricks that I've been honing for years. So it's a little hard to explain unless you're an intern. The whole thing, but yeah. Yeah, I just realized that once I did describe my work as ornate or ornamental, and it just kind of like came out, but I don't know if I actually believe that. I mean, it is in a way, but like I said, the undercover modernist kind of comes out in me, and I think as much as it is dense I use a lot of those kind of like these arabesque curves and the Gothic arches, and they're really there. They're objects, and they're really there to paint a picture. I think a lot of the structures, like I said, I try to use as many strings, for example, as it would take as I would need to make it disappear. So there's not as much superfluous stuff. I take away so much that as dense as they may seem, I'm actually taking away so much too. And was that your question? How I would describe, how I start? Yeah, I mean, I think like my older stuff, or just, I mean, it's most of that was like 5 or 6 years. So that the older stuff was kind of a little more had a little bit more of a center, and I'd kind of, I think I needed to like map something out, and I'd extrude things up, and now with the pedestal work, I'm kind of really trying to unlearn some of that, or like not rely on a map and like drawing out these parameters. I really want to destabilize both myself and the work. And so sometimes I go in a little more blind. Sometimes I go in with a very strict plan, and I follow it kind of, but then it always changes. And sometimes I go in a little bit more, I know like, sometimes 30% of what I want to do, and I just stick with that. And, I try not to make decisions too prematurely. I try to just, I don't try, it's just sometimes I can't possibly conceive of all the answers at once, so I just deal with what I know. So if like for the last work, for example, like I knew that I needed to work with the plinth and I needed to work with the figures, and that's what I started with. And that's all I knew, and it was kind of weird, but the rest kind of, kind of helps, each decision helps dictate the next, or kind of shapes things. And I think I just I work best when I can kind of maintain orchestral control over a number of parts. So I don't know, that's maybe how my brain thinks. I've never made like one whole thing except for maybe the bronze, but that was its own thing because of the material being different. I couldn't really make, one of my works in bronze. So yeah, it's just add and subtract. Like, it's really weird, I'll just be looking at it, and as I have my coat and I have my overalls off, I'm like ready to go home. I'm like, oh, I need another stair there. So like, I have to stop and put this little stair section in, and then, it's like you just look at it, and sometimes it's a simple compositional thing, and, it'll, like I said, it'll just kind of like scream at you one moment when you probably least when you're ready to go home. So it's really annoying.
So I think it's more in the
Mm-hmm.
Actually, and I was wondering how important that is for the audience to know those kinds of like stories, like.
Well, I'm telling you.
Right, exactly, but like
No,
people who weren't there,
yeah,
how important that is.
it's not.
It's not.
To me, do I care? I don't really care that much. I mean, I feel like there's enough equipment in there. There's enough of, no one's going to look at it and be like, oh, that's, a fruit basket. It's, I give it some direction, but for people to need to know that necessarily like came from, my discovering B flat, coming out of black holes, or, that this is like the story of my life. I don't know. Like, I think that some of that's just an excuse to get started, and that's perfectly fine with me, and I think that's what most people do, and I kind of don't always stick to my own stories, so it's totally fine. Like, I think it's something that I tell you just because I presume you're interested and you're here, so, it's like, again, it's just stuff that inspires or just initiates a work, but it's not necessarily the meaning. I don't know what it means. I have no idea. I mean, it's not a fruit basket probably, but it's just like, yeah, I don't care that much, honestly. I mean, I kind of care everyone cares what people think, but I'm not like you must know this amazing fact, that I've discovered. But, known that. Yeah, that's okay. I don't know. I have to give that up at some point. It's kind of, maybe it's like the secret manual you can read about if you're interested. It's the same as like someone in the audience of like a magic show. It's like they were, rewards the people who investigate, and that's. I mean, it would just be impossible if everyone could trace everything that has ever occurred to me. Well, I mean, I think if they get a general sense, or if they're interested, or they walk around it, I've done good. Like that's like, it's a lot to ask of someone to know everything that you're thinking, or everything that the work you think means. You have no idea. So, but I do like telling people, because, it's the same thing like when you'll hear a song that you like by a band and you realize, oh, that's actually based on Romeo and Juliet or whatever. Like, it's interesting, probably. For me, it's interesting, but you don't need to know that to like it, probably, or to be affected by it, at least, I know it's kind of a tricky thing in school to say, but, you don't have to be overly accountable for everything. I think if you can just trust what you're doing. I mean, you're accountable. Like I'm accountable to everything I do. So sorry, I'm in trouble. I'm not saying I'm like off the hook. I'm just saying. Okay. Last chance. All right. Thanks.